Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pie Before Dinner. This is your friendly neighborhood mathematics guru and talk show host. I am Dr. Lou, and you are on Pie Before Dinner talking math with Dr. Lou. I have in studio with me today a very good friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Brian Williams. He is the head of the
Crim
Prince,
Center,
the
the
Crim Center
Alonzo Crim
at
Center, yes.
Alonzo Crim Center at Georgia State University. Hey, Brian, thanks for coming back on the show. Love having you, man.
I'm glad to be here, Lou. This is always a lot of fun.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Listen, you're not a stranger to our audience. People still talk about the show we did last year, in the year that was 2020, when we talked about finding the joy in your math and flipped. It's first time we've had to flip a title on a show in real time, and we flipped that title to finding the math in your joy, finding the science in your joy. That was a watershed moment for me, Brian, because it really helped me to really think about and center myself in the idea of how people flourish, right? The flourishing. I guess that's 2020 as well, right? It turned our attention to not just living, but how am I living? And so that's important. And so I'm thankful for that. And so I'm glad to have you back to talk with you about another dear topic of ours. What's next, right? What's life after 2020? What's life after COVID? What's life now in 2021? What's it going to look like? And I want to talk about that at the intersection of math and science and community and social justice, which seems to define both your work and my work, right? We're not this one thing, but this intersection. And Pie Before Dinner is a show at this intersection. But before I get into that, let me say I did have a piece of bean pie today. I was at a stoplight today, and I bought some bean pie from one of my Nation of Islam brothers. And that thing, you guys didn't tell me about that. That's some good stuff. That's some crack stuff right there. So I just had to bring it home and put it in the freezers because I'm trying to ease up on some of that stuff. And so
Your first time? Is that your first time?
Yeah, I can't remember having that before. That was my first time. But I was thinking of Pie Before Dinner, and that just came to mind. But look, Brian, it's great having you on the show. Listen, a lot's happened since we were last here, right? When we were last here, we were in the beginning stages of lockdown life and pandemic life. It was April. I don't even think we were into some of the protests that we'd seen, not the summer protests we saw here, I know, in D.C. and other places around the country. So we've had a summer of protests, right? We've had an election, a contested election all the way up to Supreme Court and into Congress and Senate. We've had a discovery, the unpacking of several COVID-19 vaccines, right? And we've had a failed implementation plan, if you will, distribution plan, at least here in the United States. Other countries are seemingly as well looking to work through the challenges of distribution of this COVID-19 vaccine. I want to talk about that with you, the science guy, Brian Williams, science. And we've had that. So we've had, in addition to that, we've had what some are terming an insurrection, what some have termed an attempted coup. Certainly a rebellion of sorts and a refusal to accept the rule of the will of people in the election here in the United States. And that caught the world's attention, right? And so we've had a 2020 of upheaval. We've also had a 2021, a January of 2021 already that has, hasn't slowed down any, right? And so we're seeing these things happen. I want to get your take on what you see as happening out there in the world today in general. We can talk in general. What do you see as some of the underlying forces that are coming out of that are driving your work? And tell us about your work as well as you do that.
Yeah, so Lou, you and I have been doing work together for a while now. Even if we're not in the same place, we're working alongside each other. And this idea around how do we create a world that is more just, that is more equitable, And for you, it's been through mathematics. For me, it's been through science. And for both of us, it's been through public education. This focus on public education.
We're like twin
And
brothers, man.
we are. Look at us. But I think that, for me, one of the things that keeps bubbling up for me through all of this is I keep wondering, how does public education intersect with what's happening, whether it's in our response to COVID or our lack of response to COVID, with our understanding of racial equity and our response to racial equity. Over and over and over again, I keep thinking back to, what are we not doing in public education that continues to um, not prepare people to be in this world in authentic ways, and to be in this world as community members and as human beings. For instance, I've watched over and over again as people are presented with information, and this idea of, well, I have my own facts, right? This idea of alternative facts that emerged in the last 4 years, and people's just unwillingness to look at information that's presented to them, look at the evidence, and come to a conclusion that's actually based in some sort of truth.
Mhm.
And so, both our response to COVID and our response to our last election are rooted in this idea of people's inability to look at information, think about it critically, and come to a conclusion that something is true or not. And that's been something I've given a lot of thought to within. I'm looking at public education and how we play into that.
Yeah. You know, Brian, interesting because we're not talking about 4, 5, 6 people, right? We're talking
No, we're
about
not.
large swaths of people that have been impacted by the campaigns of misinformation.
Yes.
And it's twofold for me. It's people who have orientations towards others that are rooted in things like white supremacy, things like racism, um, and fear, right? Driving a lot of these things. So it's these orientations. But then there's the machine behind these systems of disinformation and misinformation that are preying on people, and propelling, organizing and propelling people, whether it's media. Um, that brings me to a question, though, Brian, and you asked this question backstage. I want to bring it up to the front. A lot of these folks that we're talking about, a lot of the forces we're talking about, came up through education systems like public education. Is the ones that we have spent our life defending public education. I want to push on that because I'm not sure I'm a public education defender anymore. But I want to.
That's a good one.
I'll wait. I know I didn't want to. I didn't want to spring that on you too soon and before
Ah,
the
ah,
interview. But we spent our lives defending public education, right? And what what's gone wrong? If you accept that public education should take some responsibility in the kinds of citizens it produces. And I don't think that's a far stretch. In so many creeds and missions in public ed, we talk about it was commonplace to say to produce productive citizens, right?
yes, yes,
So now we're seeing so many people who haven't it hasn't that it's produced that maybe haven't acted productively, particularly in this case here. What's going wrong? What do you think is in play in public education that leads to this kinds of person steeped in misinformation efforts? And what do we do differently? What's the vision? But what do you think is wrong now with the way in which we're educating people?
yeah. And I want to be clear, because I think that this could very easily slip into an indictment of our teachers or our principals, right? We don't want to put them on trial. Well, I don't
No,
want to
I'm
do that.
playing. I'm
I don't
playing.
want to do
Okay,
that. I don't want to do
okay.
that, right? Because here's the
No,
thing.
I'm not. Yeah, I got you.
Because I think here's the thing, Lewis, and I think you kind of teased around it earlier. I think that we often think about power and people wielding power, but oftentimes it's the other way around. It's power wielding people. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing firsthand how power can wield multitudes of people in this country to power's will. And the same thing is true of our public schools. That if you ask parents, well, what kind of school do you want for your kids, or what kind of education do you want for your kids? People will talk about going to college, and people will talk about getting a good job. So we have reduced public education to workforce development. So when you
Mm,
talk about citizenship,
yes. Yes.
citizenship is not part of our schooling right now. It's right community, being an engaged community member, that's not a part of our public educational system right now. And in fact, some would probably argue that depending on where your school is located, the education that you're being given is an education to prepare you to be a really great laborer, right? To take orders, to follow instructions, to not really think for yourself, but to be told what to do. And once we get to that place of that's the purpose of education, then we understand why we're here, right? We
Yeah.
understand why people so easily would fall into the trap of, well, somebody told me this, and so now this is what I believe, because we were never ever taught to think.
Yeah. Hey, listen. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Brian, I want to push even further, right? I don't see much of it. I want to be very clear now. I mean, my hesitancy to disrupt teachers
Mm-hmm.
or to talk about teachers can't keep me from disrupting the premise of public education. And I
Right.
think in my career, that's what I've done. There's something in my training that has just got me loyal to teachers, loyal to public education, just loyal. So where I'm defending it regardless, as if it's I see it as some civil right, no doubt. But I've defended, and I've not necessarily, and where I am now, I'm pushing it more now to really disrupt its constructs. And the reason I say that, Brian, is because we have seen racism and white supremacy not as these, not as an outcrop of some misguided extremists, right? I reject the premise that white supremacy is extremism. It's actually endemic, right? And if you look, if for scholars who are
Always.
following the show, critical race theory, black critical theory, it's endemic. It's
Always.
within every single system in the West, whether it's education system, the economic system, housing, every financial system, every single system has been propped up and has itself
Been
uh,
infected.
benefited
Yep.
from the subjugation of people of color in some way, shape, or form. This we know, that's not a secret. Um, but it's so insidious to me. What I realize that it's so insidious, it's part of our systems, that it's not just simply about a white person who might have white supremacist beliefs, or it's inside of,
Check.
it's part of everything we partake of. And so I think about the ways in which I am also compromised as a liberator, compromised in the space of education. And that's what I think about when I think of public education, and us not being able to critique it hard enough so that there is a clear delineation between public education and the public that it creates.
That's right.
And it's created a kind of a public in some way, shape, or form that has supported Donald Trump, that has supported white supremacy, and people who support it. So that's what I'm having real struggles with around public education. How do we disrupt and deconstruct the very essence of how its curriculum, its programming, its policies that lead people to subjugation?
Yeah, and I think, Luke, public education. So I think I'm with you. I think I look at public education, however, as a necessity in our democracy. Your ability to be educated, and now we have to talk about what it does it mean to be educated, right? I mean, that's one of the questions, right? What does it mean to be educated? But your ability to be educated cannot be connected to I have power, I have wealth, I'm a male, I'm white, right? Public education was meant to disrupt those systems. Now, what ended up happening is you're absolutely right. Public education got infected because it sits within the same system that's
Pandemic.
steeped
That's
in
right.
those things, right?
That's
So the
right.
question is, how do we go into public education and begin to disrupt those systems within public education? And so when I talk about teachers, for example, a lot of our teachers are in schools and are feel the tension of being a part of the system and at the same time working to disrupt the system. How do you do those two things? How do you do it well? A lot of my teachers that I work with will say, how do I do that and keep my job? And I think the tension that I try to create for them is that by failing to do that, you are creating kind of the world that we're in right now, right? Where people see that because my skin is light or I identify as white or somebody identifies me as white, therefore that makes me superior. And because you are black or you are identified as black, that therefore makes you inferior. That is taught in our school system. We teach it through our curriculum every single day to children. And then when they come out of school and believe that, we say, oh my God, where did you get that from? And so I think part of one of the things we need to think about is how do we disrupt those systems that are in public education? But to disregard public education or to throw public education away, I think would fail, would create a situation where a lot of people would not have the opportunity to be educated.
Yeah,
We create another system, I'm sure, Lou, right? We've done that already, right? When education was not available to us, we created a public education system for ourselves.
that's
So
right.
we would figure out how to do it.
Yeah, and now interesting because I've seen this with COVID, right? I've seen under the pandemic, I've seen parents turning to homeschooling in more numbers. I've seen parents rejecting simply, here's a packet, send to home to do some work. I've seen parents looking to have very real educational experiences outside and with their own children. I've seen parents looking for something more and something different. One of my good colleagues has said, this is a time to remix education, and maybe remixing means
Yes.
pulling from all sorts of things. It's pulling from granny, it's pulling from uncle, it's pulling from Montessori. Maybe it's pulling from what's happening in private schools and charter schools. And, in DC, there are some charter schools that are really looking to do some powerful things. I'm not talking about the chains, the franchise chain system of charter schools. I'm talking about people who start charters out of a love for their communities,
Local
right?
charters, yeah.
Local charters, right? And so that's different, right? So I think what I've seen come out of this is people looking for other ways. So I think there's one way, right, to challenge what we're seeing produced in our society is to go outside and create new schools and or look for new avenues and different directions. That's one way, right? The other way I think you pointed to is to to stand up and for teachers and to educators and principals and leaders and parents and community to demand more from their school, to demand more from their public education systems. I know in my country, and I know there are some folks listening from Bermuda as well here. I just think education reform has been hijacked.
Yeah.
It's been the people of Bermuda have been held hostage, and we've been subject in the worst way in sort of like a traumatic incident that's constantly put before us in the kinds of structures and curriculum that's thrust upon our people. And now we're talking about we had middle schools, now we're going to cancel middle schools and put in some other structures. And we don't give people an opportunity to really shape the education that they want. And when we say we do, we call it consultation, but there's just no such thing as consultation in the education in my country. Just no such thing. It's what you spoke to earlier, compliance. So where public education could be a practice of freedom, so many places it's become a practice of compliance. And so I think that's one way. And I'm trying to figure out ways to help teachers and parents in particular have more ownership of the space, or take back more ownership of the space of public ed and education in general. What's your
And
thoughts?
Lou, I think it's going to be critical. I think that we're at a really important. I don't want to say a crossroads. We're definitely at a really important point in
Hmm.
public education because so it's interesting how everybody talks about learning losses, learning losses. Everybody's concerned about the learning losses for our children in response to COVID. My thing is that I think people like you and me that have been in this business for a while, like, man, hey, where are we talking? Why weren't we talking about learning losses prior to COVID? There have been generations of children in our country who have not been served by public education, who've been suffering from quote unquote learning losses, but these have been acceptable losses in terms of public education, right?
Yeah.
we are fine with 30% of our kids, 40% of our kids not getting what they need. And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate that those kids tend to look alike. They tend to come from the same zip code. Um, and so I think we're at a really important point because we have had to pause in public education a bit, right? I think the movement to virtual has caused us to stop and slow down just a little bit. In some places, we've had to put the brakes on entirely because kids aren't logging on, they don't have access, and those types of things. When we come back, if we come back in the fall, I think between now and the fall, we have an opportunity to really speak up and say, this is what we expect to see when we come back. Because I guarantee you, this machine, when we come back in the fall, they're going to put the pedal on the floor and they're going to go forward.
Yeah.
They're going
Hey.
to move forward.
Yeah. I think COVID has. I think I'm going to be a part of that group that really pushes for change in the sense that I think COVID has broken my reliance on the status quo. Right?
Yeah.
Um, we need more creators we need more power and funds in the hands of family. I've been, and I'll switch over into this question. And the question really I'm talking from is now, what's your vision for public education? I have some things that I'm really, really going to be pushing and pressing for that's come out of the last year. But yeah, I think parents, one of the biggest things, Brian, to your last point, I think one of my biggest pet peeves is how we've taught parents not to really challenge public education. And sometimes it's out of respect for the schools, respect for the system. And we haven't learned to challenge, particularly in some of the Black communities I'm a part of, we haven't really challenged education like we might challenge police violence, right? You know, and sometimes bad education is a form of violence.
That's
Bad
right.
education is a form of violence. It's a slow violence, right? It's
That's
a
right.
slow moving, long lasting, violent pill that we have sometimes swallowed. And I wish people would organize and to fight its constructs a bit more as well. But let me switch questions to our final question. I'm not going to
Yeah.
have a long show tonight. We're keeping within our 35 to 45-minute range.
I got to do the dishes, man. You know.
Brian, when you think about your work with teachers, let's stick with that, and
Yeah.
parents and science, what's your vision moving forward? Like, what do you see? What does it look like? What does it look, sound, and feel like?
Yeah. So I try to live my vision or create my vision for what I want to see in public education with every single teacher I work with. And what I want is I want a school where children, regardless of who they are, where they come from, have the opportunity to live up and into their full potential as human beings. And so, that means that if there is a child sitting in front of you who who is of African descent, right, whose connections are not in Europe, right, that's not where their heritage is rooted, then can they see themselves in your teaching? Can they see themselves in your curriculum? Can they see themselves in their own learning? And right
Mm,
now, for many of our schools, that is not the case. And so, what I'm trying to do is to
mm,
create teachers that can create that type of learning experience for children. Because, to your
okay.
point, Lou, to sit in a classroom day after day after day and not only be told that you aren't valuable, that you didn't create anything, that you come from a lot of people or heritage of people that's not rooted in anything worth valuing, and not only that, to be told that you're basically invisible is a traumatic experience. And many of our children resist that traumatic experience. They push back hard. And when they push back, we end up expelling them, suspending them, punishing them, kicking them off the island. And so, the kids that are the most in need of a fair and just education, and the ones that resist and call out for that fair and just and equitable education, are the ones that we end up punishing, right?
Mm,
And so my vision for education is one where children learn what it means to be who they are first and foremost, that they're whole and complete, and they learn that. They learn about their community and their culture and how to value it and what beauty lies there. They learn how to participate in our democracy as well as our industry, our professions, right? They chase their own dreams and their own interests. I'm looking for a school system where children are treated as human beings and not something to be prepared for later on for the workforce. Right?
Yeah.
It's the question we love to ask kids. What do you want to do when you grow up? As if their humanity begins when they get a job. And I want to create schools where we recognize that the people in front of us are human beings with dreams, goals, fears, anxieties, and we need to address those things on a daily basis. It's a
Yeah.
much different school system. It's a
Yeah.
much different school system.
I appreciate that, and I'm just going to pause for station identification. You are listening. Listen, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat here. You are listening to Pie Before Dinner Talking Math with Dr. Lou. I'm here with Dr. Brian Williams, head of the Alonzo Cream Center for Urban Education in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta,
Brian is a
Georgia.
colleague, friend of mine, Georgia State University. Brian, so I'll jump to so what I wish for public education, and it's for educate. I want to. At some point, I'm going to stop using that word public education because I think there's some guilt associated with one, not being in public education, or two, being in it and feeling like you have to defend it. And I want to just push away those boundaries just for a second for the shape of the conversation. I'm longing for education where we have two of my wish, but I'll say one, where I want to see more content creators for Black communities. And so I've realized here with COVID, with the shift to virtual, that the market was flooded by new content, but it wasn't new content prepared for our children. It was new content pushed upon us, prepared for other people's children. And when we looked at it, we looked deeper into the community of mathematics and maybe even science and STEM. We couldn't find uh, really dedicated firms, dedicated companies, dedicated content creators that were featuring beautiful faces of Black community, beautiful content centered around Black community. So the stuff you were saying about going to public school and learning about who I am and flourishing in who I am, I was finding a dearth of content just
Yeah.
by looking up very simple things. And then I realized that the capital base that is pushing schooling, the production facilities of books and websites and media and worksheets they often go under scrutinized, but they're because of their lack of disconnect or the lack of connect to the communities you and I are part of, you and I serve. And so I want to see more of that. That's my vision, is that we see a renaissance of production around education content for our people. And I always assumed that it was there, just not being used. But I'm now of the impression that there's just not a whole lot of it, particularly in mathematics and science. Now, I love what has happened in Black literature. There's been a flood of literature, Black literature books in this space, right, around Black authors and Black publishing companies. And I would love to see the same thing. I'm really going to push. I was just talking to a colleague of mine, Dr. Charles. I'm going to really push for that we begin to create these companies, create these corporations that are BIPOC-led, Black, Indigenous, people of color owned and led, and we're changing the landscape. So that's my big wish list, Brian, is that we have more content. And I know your website. I know that you've been doing this as well, creating culturally relevant content, right? What's the website, Brian? Is it
Brian Williams Science.
BrianWilliamsScience.com, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Let me make sure I put that up, Brian. But yeah, what do you think about that? We need more content.
I think it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. And here's the thing. What I've been trying to do at Brian Williams Science, and it's on my social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. What I've been trying to do is to present science. Asa Hilliard said, right? His thing is, look, basically he was saying, this work around pluralism, around presenting science as the contributions of a collective. People of all types have been involved in science. Same with mathematics, right? that to present it that way is not like, okay, I'm trying to do something special. You're trying to do something special when you present it as it's only being the contributions of white people, Europeans. That's the only people that created math and science. That's doing something special. To do it in an honest and authentic way, in a realistic way, would be everybody has been a part of this community. So that's what I do at Brian Williams Science, right? I'm trying to present science in an authentic and honest way that says, look, lots of people have contributed to our understanding of our world. That's what science is about, trying to make sense of our world. Black, indigenous, African, European, men, women, girls, boys, children, people have contributed to science. And so I'm trying to present it in a way that normalizes the idea of a pluralistic scientific community. And and so to your point, I want to see this, and I want to see it in our schools, but I want to see it presented not as we're going to do this for Black History Month, right? I want to see us do this as this is what science and math is all year round.
I like that, Brian. Thank you very much for that. I have a cheap plug for Black History Month because Pie Before Dinner is doing a special series. Just thanks for bringing that to attention. We are doing a special series with Black History Month where we're focusing on quite a few topics. One of which actually next week will be the science of slavery, and how the history of science in slavery and throughout the slave experience. That's going to be Dr. Jennifer Stimson's going to be be our special guest for that show.
You got Ebony McGee coming up too.
Ebony McGee. In fact, let's put a little quick thing up. So yeah, we have Dr. Jennifer Stimson next week, and Ebony McGee February 10th. Black, Brown, and Bruised in STEM, and Albert Cook, and we're going to be talking about challenging white supremacy and the M word, right? And then the non-European origins. And speaking to what you were just saying, the non-European origins of mathematics. We're reading this book, Crest of the Peacock. It's the Crest of the Peacock. It's a thick book, but we're going to be reading at least pieces of it to talk about. Yeah, Brian, thanks. That's really important, right? That we offer people a public education system, an education system that's authentic and true. And right now, and that goes back to the misinformation space, right? Right now, we're not offering from a content perspective, oftentimes, authentic experiences in science and math because it's not inclusive of all of the brain trust of what's going into science and mathematics. So that's an important one. One of the things we actually have a question from the audience. I want to take that question as well, Brian. So no, thank you for that. Thank you for pushing on that. Listen, we have a question. We have about a few minutes left. Let's take that question from the audience before we go. What are your thoughts on restorative practices used in public schools?
Yeah,
I have a real interesting thought on that, but I want to hear yours first.
I see promise in restorative justice practices. It's interesting. The more and more I read about things like the Mary Wright Edelman calls it the cradle to prison pipeline. Other people call it the school to prison pipeline. It becomes very clear that our discipline policies, things like zero tolerance and expulsions, are actually fueling.
One of my colleagues called it the prison. One of my colleagues called it the prison to prison pipeline.
Yeah. Hey, look, going to some of these public schools, and it looks and feels like a prison, right? And so I think that what restorative justice does is it gives us another way of thinking about how do we repair communities. In fact, the United States could learn a lot from restorative justice, right? This idea of truth and reconciliation, and that there's something about putting something back together that you are responsible for breaking. I think it builds community. I think it gives us an alternative to things like expulsion and suspension. And there's a lot of promising research out there that talks about what it does for school communities and what it does for student learning. So I think it gives us another tool to use in our toolbox other than kicking kids out of school.
So let me tackle this, Brian. I think it's great. Listen, no one will say that they don't like restorative practice. It sometimes doesn't fit because the school structure isn't structured for it. But I love restorative practice. But think about this. We should get to a point where public education in itself is restorative.
Absolutely.
That we're at the practice of education is restorative. The fact that we need it shows that our current schools are not restorative and are not trauma responsive, trauma informed and they're not healing spaces. So the fact that we're still fighting for some of these restorative practices is really and really interesting indictment on what our schools aren't but can be, right? But they need to be healing places. Beyond restorative practice, that's restoring. But I want to see our schools be flourishing places, places where practice, flourishing practice, where I go to school not just to learn, not just to be educated in a particular field or content, but I want to go to school to flourish as a human being. How do I flourish? How do our communities flourish? What? How can I flourish in my identity, in my aspirations, in my community connections and relationships? How do I flourish? Am I flourishing? And I don't. When I ask that question, it's a very different question. Restorative practice is great, but I'm also pushing on the other end of having school practice to be more to consider how people flourish,
I
not
agree,
just
Lou.
exist in the space.
I agree. I agree, and I think the other piece of it is that we can't swap out one bad system for one that's supposed to be new and innovative, right? So if our goal is to control children, to push them through a system that's trauma based, right? To where you're sitting in a classroom day after day, not engaged, bored out of your mind, don't see yourself in the curriculum, taught to sit there and do what I say, being yelled at, and
Uh,
the expectation is that you don't resist, and then when you do resist, instead of expulsion, now it's restorative justice. We have not solved the problem. We still have not solved the problem. The problem is the system that we're forcing our kids to go into. And maybe, if, like to your point, if we change that system, we'd have less of a need for things like restorative justice or restorative practices because children would be engaged.
yeah, yeah. Well, listen, that's all we have for our questions tonight. Every week we want to take at least a question or two from the audience. Thank you very much for engaging, Georgina. We appreciate you. There's some more questions. Brian, there's another question. I'm afraid to put it up.
Now let's do
Um,
it.
no, Brian, I'm afraid, but it's okay. So how do we fight for restorative practice usages in a punitive style system? Now I know where this question is coming from, and so I'm going to push on it myself.
Yeah.
So much of what I have seen in public ed in my own country it stemmed from a very punitive belief, a very punitive orientation towards black children, right? And that it's just there's no nonsense, zero tolerance. Um, that if something happens to you, something happens, you are heavily penalized in a soft expulsion, hard expulsion, and the two restorative practice, Georgina, quite frankly, doesn't fit in a punitive style system. Um, it just doesn't fit. And so what we have to challenge in that case is the system. And what's another word for punitive style system? That's a prison system, right? So we're talking about a prison to prison pipeline, and it doesn't fit, right? And so either you have to look for other systems outside of that. I mean, why are we so tied to public schools? Sometimes you have to go to systems outside of that, or you have to fight like crazy inside of the system. And I think there's nothing short of, in that case, of uprising them in space, and it can be done. Is critical, but certainly you need better information, more innovative, more examples of ways in which people are implementing restorative practices in systems that might seemingly be more punitive. There's a ways to go as well. COVID-19 just really has just exhausted my patience with trying to work inside of these systems to do the stuff well.
Yeah, yeah. To add to that, Lou, I like your idea of seeing it. Like sometimes we need to see it. Brian Stevenson, when we had him come speak, he said one of the things we've got to be able to do is to be able to see the world we want to create, and sometimes we struggle to create it because we really can't even see it. And if you can't see a school that doesn't really rest on these punitive practices, if you can't even imagine that, then no matter what you do, you're not going to really be able to embrace restorative practices, restorative
Yeah.
justice. And the
You know,
question is also is why? Like why these practices with these kids? Because there are other schools where when little Johnny acts up, the response to little Johnny is, well, little Johnny's bored. We need to challenge him. and little Johnny gets more engaging with it,
Whoa,
right?
Brian, stop,
You know,
drop. Now you're getting us, taking us on another path. Just when I looked at the White House and I saw these people marching on the White House and
yep.
breaking into the cabinet grounds, the Senate and the congressional hall space, the CNN went on this at first, right? Was these misguided, poor, misguided people, blah blah blah, and I quipped to one of my networks how when white people do violence, for example, we try to humanize the violence.
Try to
The power of
understand.
supremacy is you try to humanize the violence. When black children um, are in, participants in violence, for example, we demonize and criminalize. We're quick to criminalize, and even if we're seeing even through these police stop and search and the police killings that we've seen, that even if they haven't committed a crime, they get criminalized. And so, there's a real serious bend towards the demonization and criminalization of black children. And sometimes that gets mirrored in public school, to your question. And I don't think sometimes it's people take it as serious enough to want to fight for it. I've seen people in my country march for pay raises but not stuff like this. And so it's a moral issue, right? And so I just can hope that people can see it as a moral issue, and those fighting on the ground continue to do so around this deadly space.
It's a consciousness issue too. It's a consciousness issue too, Lou, in that the people who are most harmed by that punitive system are children, and those are the ones that we're least likely to listen to about the need to change the system,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And so we don't have the consciousness that would drive us to say this is this is inhumane for us to do this to children. We need to stop. If we asked our children, they would definitely tell you to stop doing this because they have the consciousness to inform them.
So to that person's question, how do we fight for restorative practice? One that uses it in a punitive style system. I would love to see people investigate more student voices, more children voices. I know that when we talk about child abuse, when we hear from students and when we hear from children, that's a powerful driver of the space. That's a powerful driver. And so that's one way of fighting too, right? Let's hear from the students. Find a way to get more student voices around the system as well. That's another way of doing it. Listen, we're gonna have a whole show on just discipline and how discipline policies can be so punitive in our system. But thanks. So tonight, guys, thank you very much for that question. Tonight we've been talking about public school education and public schools life after COVID. We're passionate about school, passionate about public school. And
I'm gonna bring you back over. We're gonna bring you back over.
No, I'm there. Listen, I love public school. I love schools. I'm just really so disenchanted with the systems of oppression, and I know you are as well. And so we love our schools. We also love math and science. Brian, it's great to have been great to still be a partner with you, a thought partner, a colleague in solidarity in this freedom fight in education. Hope to have you back on the show soon.
And Lou, can I add just one last thing that I think is very, very important, right? Is that for our children specifically, as they're living in this world that is infected with things like racial injustice and oppression and COVID-19, they've been dealing with this stuff for about a year now, nonstop.
That's right.
I want to ask and pray that our parents and our teachers, let's keep an eye on our children. Let's please keep an eye on our children and their mental health, because our children are dealing with a lot right now, and they're shouldering quite a bit right now. And our expectation is that they'll just continue to do this day in and day out. But our children, like every human being, they have breaking points. So I'm going to encourage us to keep an eye on our children and to make sure that we're taking care of their mental health.
I think you're quite right. There you have it. And that's a great note to end on. Parents, we love you. Teachers, we love you. Educators, hang in there as well. Let's get through this 2021. Looking forward to another day with renewed visions and renewed strength around public education. You have been listening to Pie Before Dinner. I am your host, Dr. Lou. Please be a great guest and a great audience, and forward this and share this to as many people as you like. Thank you very much. See you next time when we kick off our Black History in Mathematics Ubuntu series. You are listening to Pie Before Dinner. Take care.